Darren Grant glanced at his watch as he drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Georgetown. He was only minutes away from a critical meeting with investors, and he knew that even a slight delay would make a bad impression. Adjusting his tie, he leaned forward, eyes scanning the road for his next turn. The low hum of the GPS barely cut through the gentle jazz playing in the background, a calming atmosphere that he had no idea was about to shatter. Just as Darren turned onto a main road, the flash of blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser had pulled up behind him. Confused but cautious, Darren pulled over, feeling his stomach tighten. He'd done nothing wrong, but the familiar sense of dread began to creep in, a feeling he had carried unwanted throughout his life. As the cruiser parked behind him, Darren noticed the officer approaching with a rigid, authoritative stance. Darren rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the wheel. Every movement deliberate, calculated. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone flat, devoid of any warmth. Darren moved slowly, reaching into his glove compartment while keeping one hand on the wheel. His eyes darted back to the officer, searching his expression, but there was nothing, just an unyielding stare. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darren asked, his voice steady as he handed over his documents. "You were seen near the scene of a crime just now," the officer replied curtly, glancing over the papers without meeting Darren's eyes. "We have reason to believe you might be involved." Darren blinked, struggling to process the accusation. Involved? He'd been focused on the meeting, his mind wrapped around the conversation he was about to have with his investors. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "There must be a mistake," he replied carefully. "I'm on my way to a meeting. I'm not aware of any." "Step out of the car," the officer interrupted sharply. The words hit him like a punch. Darren's pulse quickened. Part of him wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, but he knew better. Years of experience had taught him that any resistance, no matter how rational, could easily be twisted, weaponized against him. His only option was to comply. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out, making sure his hands stayed visible. Another officer had joined the first, both men watching him with cold, unreadable expressions. Darren's mind raced. Did they know who he was? Or did it even matter? From their looks, it seemed they saw only one thing: a black man already guilty in their eyes. "Hands on the car," the first officer ordered, roughly pushing Darren forward. Darren complied, pressing his hands against the cold metal, his heart pounding as he felt their hands pat him down, methodically, almost as if they relished the moment. Each press of their hands felt more punitive than procedural, a violation he could do nothing to resist. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his efforts to stay composed. "You're a suspect," the second officer replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "A robbery was reported nearby, and you matched the description." Darren clenched his jaw, anger and frustration swelling in his chest. He wanted to explain, to tell them they had the wrong person, but he knew his words would mean nothing here, not in this moment. Everything he had worked for, his identity, his career, his dignity, was stripped away, leaving him as nothing more than a suspect, guilty until proven innocent. The officers pulled his hands behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. The cold bite of steel jolted through him. Each metallic clink a reminder of how quickly his day had spiraled from order to chaos. As he stood there, handcuffed, A small crowd began to gather, faces watching him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. He could see the suspicion in their eyes, hear the murmurs and whispered theories rippling through the bystanders. His cheeks burned with humiliation, but he forced himself to keep his head high, refusing to let them see his shame. As the officers pushed him toward their cruiser, Darren caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the window. He looked down at his neatly pressed suit, the polished shoes, every detail of his appearance chosen to reflect professionalism and respectability. But none of it mattered now. In this moment, all they saw was a man to be subdued, a threat to be contained. He was shoved into the back seat, his wrists straining against the cuffs. Darren closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply to keep his emotions in check. He'd faced difficult situations before, overcome countless challenges. But this was different. This wasn't a fight he had chosen. It was one thrust upon him, one where he had no say in the outcome. As the cruiser sped away, Darren looked back at his own car, left abandoned on the side of the road. His mind raced with questions, trying to grasp how he would explain this, how he'd make sense of this unraveling. The meeting, his work, his reputation, all of it faded into the background, eclipsed by the cold reality of the present. Sitting in silence, he gazed out the window as the city blurred past, his thoughts a tangled mix of disbelief, frustration, and a hard, unshakable resolve. As the cruiser pulled into the station's parking lot, Darren felt the weight of the officer's hands gripping his arms, forcing him out of the car. The metallic clink of the handcuffs echoed in his ears as they led him inside. A couple of passing officers glanced his way, curiosity flickering in their eyes before they looked away, disinterest settling back on their faces. Darren's suit and calm demeanor didn't matter here. In their eyes, he was just another suspect. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the dingy, overcrowded room. Darren was steered toward a booking desk where a tall, unsmiling officer waited with a clipboard in hand. His eyes flicked over Darren dismissively, not bothering to ask for any details beyond the basics. "Name?" the officer barked. "Darren Grant," he replied steadily, trying to maintain some composure. One of the officers behind him gave a snort. "You've got some nerve, walking around here all buttoned up like that," he muttered, almost to himself. "Thought you could blend in, huh?" Darren kept his gaze fixed ahead, unwilling to rise to the provocation. He understood that any sign of defiance could be interpreted as resistance. Years of experience and restraint came to the surface as he held himself together, focusing on staying calm. Another officer walked up, one who seemed to have overheard bits of the conversation. "Heard you're tied to that robbery on 5th Street, he said, eyeing Darren's suit with a smirk. Strange choice of outfit for a thief. Darren clenched his jaw but said nothing. He hadn't been near any robbery, nor had he ever set foot on 5th Street today. Yet he knew his words wouldn't make any difference here. The judgment had already been cast. As part of the procedure, they took him to a small holding area and instructed him to sit on a bench against the wall. Minutes stretched into an hour. Darren watched as officers walked by, some with mocking glances, others barely noticing his presence at all. Despite the heat of frustration building inside him, he remained composed. Letting his anger show would only feed their perceptions and validate their assumptions. Finally, an officer approached with a camera, preparing to take his mugshot. Darren's shoulders stiffened as he stood, looking straight into the lens with as much dignity as he could muster. He understood what this photo meant. It wasn't just an image. It was a permanent mark, something that would follow him, regardless of his innocence. The flash went off, momentarily blinding him. "All right, "Fingerprints next," the officer said, gesturing for Darren to follow him to another station. Darren's fingers were pressed down roughly onto an ink pad and then transferred to a series of sheets. The process was quick, mechanical, devoid of any empathy or care. When it was over, he was escorted to a holding cell. Darren sat down on the cold metal bench, feeling the weight of the injustice pressing on him. All he had done was drive through a neighborhood on his way to work. The stark reality of his situation settled in, as did the humiliating sting of being reduced to nothing more than a suspect in their eyes. In his mind, Darren replayed the morning, each minute detail, every turn and landmark leading up to the moment he was stopped. No matter how many times he went over it, nothing he had done warranted this. He wasn't guilty of anything but existing, but in this room, that alone was treated as an offense. More officers came and went, some glancing at him with disdain, others with indifference. The cell offered little comfort, its bare metal bench digging into his back. Despite the discomfort, Darren sat up straight, refusing to let his surroundings dictate his posture or spirit. In a corner of his mind, the thought lingered that maybe he should reveal his identity, just say the words that would end this nightmare. But Darren knew the game all too well. Declaring his position might ease his own suffering, but it wouldn't erase the prejudice that fueled it. If anything, exposing his role would only change their tune superficially. They'd apologize, pretend they'd made an honest mistake, and move on without accountability. He didn't want an empty apology. He wanted respect, and he knew that would only come with time, with patience. The door clanged open, and a fresh-faced officer walked in, glancing at a sheet in his hand before looking at Darren. "You're up for questioning," he announced with a tone that tried for professionalism but fell short. Darren stood, moving to follow him down a narrow corridor into a small, stark room. A single table stood in the center, with two chairs facing each other. Darren took a seat, clasping his hands together to steady himself. He could feel his pulse quickening again, the tension building. Moments later, two detectives entered, their expressions a blend of skepticism and thinly veiled aggression. They each sat across from him, their eyes assessing him, trying to measure him up. "We're going to ask you some questions," one of them began, voice clipped, "and we expect straightforward answers." "Understood." Darren nodded, locking eyes with the detective. He could sense their attempt to intimidate him, but he was well practiced in keeping his composure under scrutiny. It was an essential skill he developed through years of dealing with people who underestimated him. As the questions began, he maintained his calm, answering each one with clarity. But even as he responded, he could see the detectives' faces shifting with disbelief and irritation, clearly annoyed that he wasn't tripping over his words or acting defensive. They couldn't understand why he didn't seem more afraid, why he wasn't crumbling under the weight of their accusations. And Darren, despite his exhaustion, held his ground, determined not to give them the satisfaction of breaking his spirit. The hours ticked by slowly in the cold, gray interrogation room. Darren sat silently, his mind running through the events that had led him here. The officers continued to press him with questions, pointless, repetitive ones. They seemed to think that if they asked enough times, he'd finally crack and admit to something he hadn't done. But Darren wasn't just any man off the street. He had learned the art of patience, the quiet strength that came from knowing your worth, even when the world tried to strip it away. The door to the interrogation room opened abruptly, and a sergeant stepped in, his posture rigid and his face tight. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an air of authority that seemed to come from years of controlling situations like this. He glanced at the detectives and then at Darren, his eyes narrowing as if assessing the man sitting before him. "Who's this?" one of the detectives asked, clearly not expecting any new arrivals. "The name's Grant. We've been holding him for a while," the sergeant replied curtly. "But I'm here to take over." The two detectives exchanged skeptical looks, but neither spoke. They rose from their chairs and exited the room, leaving Darren alone with the sergeant. The sergeant circled Darren once, studying him intently. There was something unsettling about the way the man looked at him, almost as though he was expecting Darren to make a mistake, to show some sign of weakness. It reminded Darren of a predator sizing up its prey, but he refused to give in to the pressure. "Well, Mr. Grant," the sergeant said, his tone cold, "I hope you're ready for the truth to come out, because you're looking at some serious charges. And if you think you're going to walk away from this, you've got another thing coming." Darren remained still, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him, no matter what he threw at him. The sergeant pulled out a file and slapped it down on the table in front of Darren, the sound loud and harsh in the otherwise quiet room. He flipped through the papers, each page seeming to add weight to the tension in the air. "This," the sergeant said, pausing dramatically, "is what we have on you. A robbery in the 5th Street district, and you were seen leaving the scene in your vehicle. The witnesses identified you." Darren's eyes flicked to the papers. His heart pounded harder, not because of the accusations, but because he knew that none of this was true. He had never been on 5th Street that day. He had been in meetings all morning, preparing for his first big day at the FBI. "Is that right?" Darren asked, his voice even. "Do you have any evidence? Because I'm sure my alibi is pretty solid." The sergeant gave a short, derisive laugh. "Your alibi is irrelevant. You're here because you've been caught, plain and simple. Now, if you want to start making deals, you'd better speak up." Darren leaned forward slightly, a glimmer of frustration flickering in his eyes. "I've told you already, I wasn't at that robbery. I've got nothing to hide. But if you're so convinced I'm guilty, then I want to speak to someone who matters." The sergeant leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Someone who matters? You think you're too good for this?" "No," Darren said, his voice steady. "But I do think you're wasting your time." The sergeant stood abruptly, slamming the file shut with such force that the table rattled. "We'll see how long that confidence lasts," he muttered under his breath as he stormed out of the room. For a moment, Darren sat in silence. The door clicked shut behind the sergeant, and the room felt even colder than before. He had no idea when he'd be released, or if the lies would continue to stack against him. But he wasn't going to let it break him. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him panic. As the minutes ticked on, Darren's mind drifted. He thought about his family, his wife, his kids, and the future he had planned. This mess would take time to clear up, but he had no doubt that it would. It had to. But what if this was the beginning of something far worse than just a wrongful accusation? What if they kept pushing, fabricating more lies, turning every part of his life inside out just to cover their tracks? His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the sergeant. Instead, another officer walked in, carrying a phone. The officer's expression was unreadable as he placed the phone in front of Darren. "This call's for you," the officer said flatly, then stepped back toward the door, leaving Darren alone once again. Darren picked up the phone, his mind racing. The familiar voice on the other end made his heart skip a beat. "Mr. Grant," the voice said, calm yet authoritative. "This is Director Thompson of the FBI. I need you to hold on. Help is on the way." Darren's heart raced. The recognition, the title, it hit him like a sudden, cold wave. The voice, his identity. Everything clicked into place in an instant. The officer had just placed a phone in front of him, but what happened next would change everything. Darren's mind raced as he held the phone to his ear. Director Thompson. The name rang in his mind like a bell, but for a brief moment, it felt surreal, like he had stepped into a scene from a movie and the phone call wasn't really happening. "Director Thompson?" Darren repeated, almost as if to confirm he had heard correctly. "Yes, it's me," the voice on the other end said, steady and calm. "I'm calling because we've been monitoring the situation, and it seems there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Darren's pulse quickened. He had never been more ready for a moment of clarity. He leaned back in the chair, fighting the urge to let his emotions run wild. "I don't know what they're telling you," Darren said, his voice low but firm, "but I'm not involved in any robbery. I don't even know what's going on here. I've been wrongfully detained, and it feels like they're just trying to build a case against me." "I'm aware," Director Thompson replied, "and that's why we're taking immediate action." The line went silent for a moment. But Darren could hear the quiet shuffle of papers, the rustling of a phone being passed, and the unmistakable tension in the air. "Mr. Grant," the director continued, "we have full knowledge of your whereabouts this morning. We've reviewed your schedule, your meetings, and we've cross-referenced all the data. You were nowhere near 5th Street. In fact, you've just been appointed as the new director of the FBI, and it seems some local officers have misunderstood your presence in the area." The words hit Darren like a wave, knocking the breath from his lungs. The weight of the truth flooded over him, and for a moment, he felt everything stop. They knew who he was. They knew his position, and still, they treated him like a criminal. "The FBI?" Darren muttered, almost unable to process the enormity of it. "You mean they've been accusing me, treating me like a suspect, and all this time they didn't know who I was?" "Yes," Thompson said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "It's a series of mistakes, Mr. Grant, but we're taking swift action. I'm sending an agent to the station to clear everything up. You're not just some random person they pulled off the street. You're the man responsible for leading this country's top law enforcement agency." The realization that he had been so close to being completely misjudged and treated so horribly was overwhelming. Darren closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a surge of anger building up. He had worked so hard to reach where he was. All the years of education, dedication, and perseverance had led him to this point. And yet, here he was, sitting in a cold interrogation room, a victim of blatant discrimination and reckless policing. "I'll be all right," Darren said quietly, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that came from within. "But I want accountability. They need to understand that this kind of treatment isn't acceptable. It's not just about me. It's about the principles we stand for." "I agree completely," Director Thompson replied. "This situation will be addressed properly, I assure you. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Darren's grip on the phone tightened, and he took a deep breath. "I'm ready for whatever happens next. I won't let this define me." "You'll be released shortly," the director said. "An agent is already on their way. Hold on just a bit longer, Mr. Grant." Before Darren could respond, the line went dead. He sat there for a moment, still gripping the phone, trying to steady his breath. His mind was reeling. They knew who he was. He had been mistaken for a common criminal, treated like an outsider, and yet he had the power to bring change, to bring accountability to the system that had failed him. It was a sobering thought. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about something much bigger. He took a long breath and placed the phone back in its holder. The room felt even colder now, the weight of everything pressing on him like a storm on the horizon. But Darren knew that this moment would change everything. He couldn't just let this go. The officers who had wronged him needed to face the consequences of their actions. Minutes later, the door opened again. This time, a different officer entered, accompanied by a woman who held herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in a place like this. She was dressed in a sharp suit, and her demeanor instantly communicated authority. This was no ordinary agent. This was someone who had come to settle things. The officer gestured toward Darren. "Mr. Grant," he said, "this is Agent Williams. She's been sent by the director to handle your case." Agent Williams offered Darren a brief nod before speaking. "We'll take it from here. You're free to go, but there will be consequences for what's transpired today. Rest assured, we'll be investigating the actions of everyone involved." Darren stood up slowly, his mind still processing everything. He had been on the receiving end of dehumanizing treatment. But now, things were about to change. He was going to ensure that no one else would ever have to go through what he had endured. The drive home felt like a dream. Darren stared out the window of the car, the city lights flashing by in a blur, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere between the cold walls of that interrogation room and the realization that everything was about to change. His thoughts raced, reflecting on what had just transpired. The weight of his new position as director of the FBI still hadn't fully sunk in. But what really occupied his mind were the officers who had treated him like a criminal. The drive was long, and the silence was deafening. The agent, Williams, sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much during the ride, only a few quiet words when they left the station. But there was no need for conversation. Darren was lost in his own thoughts, his emotions swinging from anger to disbelief. As the car turned into the driveway of his home, Darren was struck by a strange sense of finality. The past hours had felt like they were part of someone else's life, an alternate reality where he wasn't the respected professional he had worked so hard to become. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by people who had judged him before they knew his name. When he stepped out of the car, the weight of his thoughts began to lift, replaced by the comforting familiarity of his home. He looked up at the front door, his sanctuary, and he couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. It was time to move forward. This moment, this injustice, was only a part of the story. He wouldn't let it define him. Agent Williams followed him to the door, but instead of entering, she stood outside, waiting for him to speak. Darren turned to her. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but genuine, "for helping me get out of there. I can't even imagine what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." Williams nodded, her expression still as unreadable as ever. "You're welcome, Mr. Grant. But this is far from over. The people responsible for this are going to face consequences, and you need to be prepared for what comes next." Darren raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Every officer involved in your detention, the ones who treated you like a criminal without cause, they're going to be investigated. There are already reports being filed, and soon there will be a full review of the local department. This is bigger than just you, Mr. Grant. It's about systemic change, He looked at her, a deep sense of resolve building within him. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure that something like this never happened again to anyone. "I'll do whatever it takes," Darren said, his voice firm. "This can't go on. People in positions of power, officers, politicians, anyone, need to be held accountable." Agent Williams nodded again. "That's why we're here. You've got the backing of the FBI now. And soon, this whole department is going to know what happens when you cross the line." With a final nod, Williams turned and walked back toward the car. Darren stood for a moment, watching her leave, before turning to the door and stepping inside. His wife, Lena, greeted him in the hallway, her face filled with concern. She had heard about the situation from a colleague, but she didn't know the full extent of it yet. As Darren stepped forward, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. The familiar scent of her perfume, the warmth of her touch. It was a comfort he didn't realize he needed until that moment. "I'm so glad you're okay," she said softly, pulling back to look at him. "I was so worried." Darren smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his face. "I'm fine. It was a misunderstanding, Lena. But it's over now. I'm home." Lena didn't seem entirely convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she simply nodded and guided him into the living room. The warmth of the house wrapped around him like a blanket, but Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing in the air. Things were about to get complicated, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Over the next few days, Darren's life took on an entirely different rhythm. The calls came in, one after another, interviews, briefings, and meetings. The FBI, the media, even his colleagues, all of them had questions. They wanted to know what had happened, how it had happened, and what Darren was going to do about it. But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. This was his moment. He had been handed an opportunity to bring about real change, not just in the FBI, but in the entire justice system. The investigation into the officers who had wrongfully detained him was swift. Within days, the news broke that several of the officers involved had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full review. It didn't stop there. The department had already begun the process of evaluating the practices and procedures that had led to Darren's mistreatment. There was a sense of urgency now, a sense that things were finally moving in the right direction. Darren knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge would come when the review was complete, when the accountability measures were in place, and when the officers responsible faced the consequences of their actions. But for now, he could feel the shift. Change was coming. As Darren sat down to a quiet dinner with his family that evening, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had the FBI behind him, and he had the strength to see this through. But as the night wore on, and Darren's mind drifted to the future, he couldn't help but wonder, how many other people had been treated like this? How many others had been ignored, mistreated, or worse? This wasn't just about his story. It was about the countless others who had been left behind, their voices silenced by a system that failed them. And Darren made a promise to himself that night. He wouldn't stop until things changed. Not just for him, but for everyone. The morning after the investigation was launched, the phone calls and emails came flooding in. Darren had known it was only a matter of time before the story became public. He had hoped, even prayed, that the incident would just blow over. But the truth was, once the news broke, everything changed. Every major outlet from CNN to local news channels reported the story in detail. A black man, a respected professional, wrongfully detained, mistreated, and nearly incarcerated by a group of officers who were supposed to serve and protect. It was a perfect storm, a story that struck at the heart of the issues plaguing the system. The public reacted swiftly and passionately, both in support of Darren and in condemnation of the police department. The pressure mounted as protests began to sprout across the city. The police department found itself at the center of a media frenzy. Local politicians, seeking to distance themselves from the scandal, began calling for swift action. The city mayor made a public statement, promising that a full investigation would be conducted. But Darren knew that words were one thing, action was another. By noon, Darren received a call from the mayor's office. They wanted to meet with him urgently. He could feel the tension in the air, like something big was about to happen. As he entered the meeting room that afternoon, the air was thick with expectation. The mayor, along with several high-ranking police officials, sat at the table, their faces serious but conflicted. The mayor stood and extended his hand to Darren as he entered. "Mr. Grant," he said, his tone formal, "thank you for coming on such short notice." Darren shook the mayor's hand, but there was no mistaking the nervous energy in the room. The mayor motioned for him to sit. "We've all seen the reports," the mayor began, his voice heavy. "This situation is beyond concerning. We're committed to ensuring that what happened to you never happens again, but we need to act fast. The public is demanding accountability." Darren nodded. He had expected this conversation, but hearing the words from the mayor's mouth made the reality of the situation feel more urgent than ever. "I agree," Darren replied, his voice calm but resolute. "The people are right to demand answers, and I'm glad to see that the city is taking it seriously. But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been mistreated by the system. It's about making sure that the officers involved in this are held accountable and that there are real consequences." The mayor glanced at his colleagues, a brief moment of hesitation passing between them. "We've already put the officers involved on leave, and the department is conducting its own internal review," the mayor said. "But we're going to need your support, Darren. We need you to be part of the solution. You have the platform now. People are listening to you." Darren leaned back in his chair, weighing the mayor's words carefully. He knew that he had a responsibility, not just to himself, but to the community that had suffered under the same system. This was bigger than one man, bigger than any one incident. "I'm willing to work with you," Darren said, his voice steady. "But we need transparency. We need an independent investigation, and we need a full public accountability process. The people have to know that this is not just about appeasing them. It's about real, systemic change." The mayor looked at Darren, then exchanged another glance with his colleagues. The room was tense, as though everyone was waiting for someone to make the next move. Finally, the mayor nodded. "All right," he said, his tone resigned but determined. "We'll get it done. You'll have our full cooperation." The rest of the meeting was filled with discussions of logistics and planning. Darren listened intently, but his mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the steps that needed to be taken. This wasn't just about this one department or this one incident. It was about creating a blueprint for change that could be implemented nationwide. He wasn't just going to fix the problem in front of him. He was going to fix the whole system. By the time the meeting ended, Darren felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The fight had only just begun. Later that night, as he sat in his home office, surrounded by files and papers, he couldn't help but think about the conversations he'd had with Lena. She had always supported him, but he could tell she was worried. The stakes were high now, and there was no turning back. When Lena entered the office, her eyes were full of concern, but there was something else there too, pride. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. Darren looked up at her, offering a tired smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Just thinking. You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "This could be the moment everything changes. You've got a chance to make a real difference." Darren stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "I don't know if it will work, Lena, but I have to try. People have been hurt for far too long. If I don't do something now, then what?" Lena kissed him gently on the cheek. "I believe in you." With her support, Darren felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for justice in this one case. He was fighting for every person who had been wronged by the system, every person who had been overlooked or ignored. And he wasn't going to stop until change was a reality. The following days were filled with meetings, press conferences, and a steady stream of media attention. Darren's story was front and center on the news, and the investigation into the local police department was gaining momentum. But there was still so much to do, so many people to reach, so many policies to change. As the weight of the task before him grew heavier, Darren reminded himself of the promise he had made. This was just the beginning. The real work was yet to come. Days turned into weeks, and Darren's resolve only grew stronger. The media circus continued to swirl around the incident, but what was once a story of one man's injustice had evolved into something much bigger. It was no longer just about Darren. It was about all the people who had faced similar abuses of power, all those who had been overlooked or unjustly treated by a broken system. The public outcry was deafening. Protests in the streets had become a regular occurrence, demanding accountability and systemic reform. People wanted answers. People wanted change. And the pressure was on the police department to act. Darren's phone rang nonstop. Journalists asked for interviews. Officials wanted meetings, and community leaders reached out for support. He had become the face of the movement for justice, whether he had wanted it or not. He knew the responsibility that came with it, and he wasn't backing down. But even as the calls and requests mounted, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been in the game long enough to know that real change never came easy, especially when it meant taking on powerful institutions. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, reviewing the latest updates on the investigation, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. It was rare for Darren to pick up calls from unfamiliar numbers, but something told him he should this time. "Hello," he answered, his voice guarded. "Mr. Grant, this is Detective Hughes from the police department," came the voice on the other end. Darren's gut clenched. "Detective Hughes," Darren replied, his tone cool. "What can I do for you?" "We need to talk," the detective said, his voice low. "There's something you need to know about the investigation. Something you won't hear in the news." Darren felt his pulse quicken. He had been expecting this moment, but it didn't make it any easier. "Go ahead," Darren said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been working on the case internally," Hughes continued, "and I've uncovered something that's not being reported. There's a network of officers involved in, well, let's just say it's more than a few bad apples. The corruption runs deeper than anyone realizes." Darren sat up straight. His instincts were on high alert. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by an insider sent a chill down his spine. "How deep?" Darren asked, his voice tight. "Deep enough that if this comes to light, it'll bring down half the department," Hughes said. "There's been a cover-up, a lot of it connected to the very officers who were involved in your incident, and I've got evidence." Darren processed the information quickly. If the corruption went as deep as Hughes claimed, this wasn't just about accountability for a few bad officers. This was about systemic change on a scale he hadn't fully imagined. "I need to see that evidence," Darren said, his voice firm. "And I need it fast. Meet me at the station tonight. I'll have it for you. But be careful, Mr. Grant," Hughes warned. The higher-ups are involved, and they'll do anything to protect themselves. The call ended abruptly, and Darren sat in stunned silence for a moment. He had hoped that the investigation would bring about reform, but now it seemed like the corruption he had suspected was far worse than anyone had anticipated. And with the city and the police department under a microscope, Darren knew this was the kind of revelation that could destroy everything. That evening, Darren met with Hughes at a deserted corner of the police station parking lot. The detective handed him a thick envelope, and Darren quickly scanned the contents. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. It wasn't just the officers who had attacked Darren that night. It was a network of cops involved in everything from drug trafficking to illegal arrests. Their connections ran deep, and many of them had ties to some of the city's most influential figures. If this information became public, it would be the end of the department as they knew it. But Darren wasn't afraid. In fact, a sense of purpose filled him as he processed the enormity of what he was holding in his hands. This was the moment. He couldn't turn back now. The next day, Darren held a press conference that would change everything. He stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing, eager to hear what he had to say. "I have just received information that I believe will shake the very foundations of this city," Darren began, his voice calm but filled with authority. "The corruption that we've been hearing about is far worse than anyone realized. It's not just a few officers. It's a system, and I won't stand by while that system destroys the lives of innocent people." The room fell silent as Darren laid out the details of what he had learned about the corruption, the cover-up, and the deep ties between the police force and criminal organizations. "I've been given evidence," Darren continued, his eyes scanning the room, "and I will make sure that this information reaches the public no matter the cost. We cannot continue to live in a world where law enforcement operates with impunity. We must hold those responsible accountable." As Darren spoke, he saw the faces of the officers in the room, the ones who had been complicit in the abuse of power. Some looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Others clenched their fists, their jaws tight with anger. But Darren didn't care. He knew this was the only way to break the cycle. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the day, the department was in chaos. Officers were placed on leave, and the internal review was expanded to include the new evidence Darren had provided. But the damage was done. Trust in the police department had been shattered, and the city demanded a complete overhaul. Darren knew it wouldn't be easy, but as he stood there, with the evidence in his hands and the eyes of the public upon him, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The weeks that followed the press conference were nothing short of chaotic. The fallout from Darren's revelations rippled through every corner of the city, and the police department found itself in disarray. Officers were suspended. Investigations into internal corruption were launched, and public trust in law enforcement plummeted to unprecedented lows. The mayor called for a full audit of the police department, and community leaders rallied, demanding changes that would ensure accountability and transparency. Darren, however, wasn't focused on the immediate storm. He knew the work ahead of him was just beginning. The fight for justice had taken on a life of its own, but it wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about ensuring lasting reform and making sure this moment wasn't wasted. He'd become the face of that change, whether he wanted to or not. And though it was a burden, Darren couldn't bring himself to shy away from it. The department's top brass had been hit hard by the scandal, but no one had been prepared for how far the corruption ran. As the investigation into the officers expanded, more arrests were made. The connections between the officers and high-level city officials only grew deeper. Darren had become a symbol of hope for the community, But the people who had benefited from the corruption weren't going to go down without a fight. It would be a long road, and Darren knew it wouldn't be easy. One day, Darren sat at his desk, reviewing the latest updates. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. "Darren Grant," he answered, bracing himself. "Mr. Grant, this is Chief Anderson from the department," came the voice on the other end. "I'd like to request a meeting. There are some things we need to discuss." Darren's mind raced. Chief Anderson had been one of the top officers in the department, and he'd been implicated in the scandal. Darren had expected a confrontation at some point. But now, hearing Anderson's voice, he couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Go ahead," Darren replied, his voice steady. "What do you want to discuss?" "I know you've seen the reports, Darren. You know what's happening here. I can't undo the past, but I want to talk about the future," Anderson said. "I think it's time for some real change. I'd like to help guide that change if you'll give me the chance." Darren was silent for a moment, weighing the offer. It was rare for someone in Anderson's position to come forward like this. Was it genuine remorse? Or was he just trying to protect himself? "Meet me tomorrow morning," Darren said finally. "We'll see if your actions match your words." The next day, Darren sat across from Chief Anderson in a small conference room at City Hall. Anderson looked worn, his once pristine uniform now looking slightly disheveled. His eyes met Darren's, and there was a quiet sincerity there. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Anderson began, his voice low. "I'm not asking for you to ignore the damage we've done, but I want to make it right. I want to be part of the solution. I want to help rebuild this department, starting with myself. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take people willing to fight for change. You've already shown that you're that person." Darren studied Anderson carefully. He wasn't sure if the man was being genuine or just trying to save face. But what he did know was that real reform required more than just exposing the truth. It required cooperation, even with those who had once been part of the system that failed so many. "I'm not sure what your role is going to be," Darren said, his tone cautious. "But if you're serious about change, I'll listen. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been affected by this corruption. If you're really ready to put in the work, then we'll talk." Anderson nodded, understanding the gravity of Darren's words. The next few hours were filled with discussions of the road ahead. It was clear that rebuilding the department would require a complete overhaul, new leadership, new policies, and most importantly, a commitment to fairness and transparency. As Darren left the meeting, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. There were still many battles to fight, and the road to reform would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long while, he believed it was possible. The public response to the ongoing investigation and the reforms that followed was overwhelming. People who had once been cynical about the possibility of real change now saw a glimmer of hope. Darren's courage had ignited a spark, and he wasn't about to let it die out. He knew that the system was flawed, beyond repair in some areas. But with the right leadership and the will to make things right, he believed that reform was possible. Darren had not just exposed the corruption. He had laid the foundation for a new future. And though the challenges were far from over, Darren Grant had never been more certain of his purpose. In the end, the scandal had changed everything. It had torn down old walls and created space for something new. Darren's work was far from finished, but the first steps toward a new beginning had been taken. A new era was dawning, one where justice was no longer optional, but mandatory. And Darren Grant, the man who had been wronged, was now leading the charge for a brighter future.